Greetings. I am His Excellency Nana Kwesi Jomoke Ife Tayo. Currently, I serve as the Southeast Regional Representative in Cobra, which is the National Coalition of Blacks for Reparations in America. I was the former national male co-chair of Cobra and national secretary before that. Currently, I also serve as the Atlanta male co-chair of the Atlanta chapter of Cobra. I also serve as the first vice president of the Provisional Government of the Republic of New Africa, and also serve as Atlanta District Representative in our government in what we call the People-Centered Council. In addition to that, I also have created inside of Cobra what I call the Ashe Committee. And the role of the Ashe Committee is to infuse spirituality and our faith tradition into the reparations movement. And how do we utilize our faith tradition and spirituality to advance the reparations movement, as well as how do we use our faith and spirituality, faith traditions and spirituality to heal ourselves along the journey of reparations as well.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. So, Brother Jomoke, how would you describe the current state of reparations? What are the successes and failures? Where is it headed now?
Okay, some very good questions. Well, one of the things is that when Cobra was first formed in 1988, and it was formed as well, first of all, we should say that the reparations movement has been an ongoing movement from before even slavery ended, all the way up to now, to this very conversation. But in 1988, what was going on at that time was that the Japanese were getting reparations. And so it was in the Congress, and it was conversations up, 86, 87, 88. And so it was thought that perhaps this would be a good time to reignite the reparations conversation, and also to expand the reparations conversation, because many Black nationalist organizations, as I mentioned, the formation of Provisional Government of the Republic of New Africa is one, the Nation of Islam and others had reparations as one of their components. But we felt that there needed to be a more concerted effort to focus just on reparations. And so the National Coalition of Blacks for Reparations in America was created and was chartered in February 1988. And one of the missions was to make reparations a household word, was to bring the awareness of reparations to our people and make it more present. And I think we've done a great job in terms of that. As I listen to Black Talk Radio, as I listen to different forums in our community, more and more of the issue of reparations comes up, more and more the issue of reparations is being addressed. There's so many different things that are going on right now. We could speak about what's going on in the college, in the Ivy League schools right now with Georgetown, with Brown University, Harvard, and other colleges that are looking at the role of slavery in their institution and looking at ways to address it. And again, the conversation of reparations comes up there. Then there's a second tier, what I'm calling a second tier of organization of universities as well. They formed themselves in a coalition called the University Studying Slavery. And actually my alma mater and the University of the South is a part of that, as well as other colleges. I think one of the colleges that was initiating of that was the University of Virginia in Charlottesville. And again, they're addressing the issue of slavery in their institutions and the issue of reparations. We have on the international front, which has also inspired us here in the United States, we have CARICOM, I believe about 2013, came together and all of the heads of state of 14 Caribbean nations agreed that they were going to make reparations a prime conversation, a prime objective for their nations, and each one of those nations created a reparations commission, and then they have a Caribbean-wide reparations commission. So that has also raised the conversation of reparations. And while there's so many different things I could just speak about, I think that have, where more and more you'll see conferences and conventions or people are beginning to address this issue of reparations. So that would be, I would say, one of the successes of Cobra is that we push forward the idea of reparations. We will go to conferences and conventions and raise the idea of reparations in terms of our public and community actions. And so now more and more you hear the resonating call of reparations. Ta-Nehisi Coates' article on reparations was a boost in the reparations movement. And Cobra was the only organization, I believe, that he actually referenced doing work around the issue of reparations in that article. So, oftentimes the work of community organizing isn't, sometimes us who work in the trenches to get things done aren't always publicly recognized for the work that we do. But we know that the work that we're doing is having a great impact, and we see it evidenced in some of those examples I just gave.
That's tremendous because, I've also known about Cobra doing this work. And when our national council started talking about reparations, we said we have to talk to Cobra, in part to learn, but also to get guidance and see how we can be a part of this larger movement. What should people know specifically about reparations, and maybe what are some strategies? And, rather than give those questions broadly, I think some of the specific questions maybe bring some of that out. Just looking at the three-prong approach of Cobra, one being legislation. How does the departure of John Conyers play into the legislation aspect? His bill, HR 40B, being one of the primary bills that at a national level put reparations as something this country is responsible for.
Sure. Well, what I would like to say, and maybe this is a good time to say it, I would encourage you to also consider interviewing Brother Cam Howard. Currently, he serves as the National Male Co-Chair of Cobra, as well as he is also our Legislative Commissioner of Cobra. So he's really been leading the strategy and the activities around HR 40, and I'll speak to it a little bit, but he could give you a much more in-depth conversation around that. But actually, I wanted to go back, and I'll come back to that, but I really wanted to go back to one of the questions, one of the first questions you asked, which I think is very important. You said, what should people know about reparations? And what I think what's important about reparations is that people need to have a clear understanding of what reparations is, because a lot of the confusion or even some of the pushback that we get around reparations, even from our own people, I believe is because people don't understand what reparations really is, the full definitions of reparations. So we start out by saying reparations first is the process of repairing and making right from a harm that has been done. Let me say that again. So the process of repairing a people or a nation for harms that have been done. So that's kind of like the dictionary definition. Then the next thing I like to share with people is what Cobra has always asserted, which is what we call the three roads of reparations. So one of those roads would be those who feel like repatriation, those who want to go back to Africa or somewhere else but leave the United States and they feel like that would be the best way that they can repair themselves and their families. So we call repatriation is one of the roads of reparations. And the second road of reparations that Cobra shares is having a sovereign nation state. We believe that, and I mentioned earlier, the Provisional Government Republic of New Africa, that we as people of African descent have the right to carve out a specific area in the United States and have that as our own sovereign nation state with our own government, with our own currency, with our own institutions to heal ourselves. And we could go back into some of the historical justification or foundations of that, which is probably a whole interview in and of itself. But I'll touch on that a little bit later. But I just want to get the three roads. So you have repatriation, sovereign nation, and then assimilation, which is the continued work on trying to make America work, in the best interest of people of African American descent. Now we say as Cobra that the first two options are the ones that we feel are the strongest options, or the one that makes the most sense for many of us in the reparation movement. However, we included the last option because we know that everybody is not ready for option 1 and 2, or may not be on that page. And again, in Cobra strove to be as inclusive as possible, and so we included that as the as another road to reparations. Now, the next layer, which I then give after I give those two definitions of reparations, which is the international definition of reparations. And that's one of the things that's very important. First of all, people need to understand that reparations is not something that another way we're trying to figure out how to get the government to do right by us or whatever. This is something that's based on international law. And so reparations stands firmly in international law. And so it's very important that people understand that. And understand that some years ago, the United Nations, because of different reparations cases that were being brought forward, created a standard working definition for reparations. And they say that reparations should come in 5 forms. And this is something I think is very important that I would like really to be one of the strongest messages out of this video that I would like people to take away if they don't remember anything else, the 5 forms of reparations. So the 5 forms of reparations is 1, compensation. So compensation, money and resources to repair the harm that was done. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that. But the next one is restitution. So restitution deals with restoring people to their legal standing. And again, I keep going back to this thing about nationhood. So what we say, for example, is that when slavery ended, and again, we can break that down a little bit, the 13th Amendment. But after slavery ended, we were not asked, our former enslaved Africans were not asked, what is it that they want? They usually, basically, we would describe what happened during the enslavement period as war. And so after the war is over, those people who are prisoners of war, which we were, would then be asked, what is it that you want to do? Would be given the options to either go back to where they came from, which I just mentioned earlier, or to have a specific territory carved out where they would live by themselves, or to continue to stay in the country that they find themselves in as a prisoner of war. And if you think about it again, usually the first 2 options would be the option that most people would take. And there's evidence that that's when our ancestors polled themselves, and there's some documentation about this, that those were the 2 options that most people wanted, either to go back to Africa or to have a separate territory carved out. Matter of fact, while we're on it, let me go ahead, because I keep putting things off, let me go ahead and speak on it a little bit more. So the 40 acres and a mule that people are familiar with. The 40 acres and a mule comes from what's called Sherman's Field Order 15, which was issued in Savannah, Georgia. And Sherman's Field Order 15, he specifically said that it was a specific territory. A lot of people are not aware of this. It was a specific territory that was carved out starting from Charleston, South Carolina, going 30 miles inland, coming down the coast of South Carolina, the whole coastline of Georgia, and into North Florida, ending right below Jacksonville at the St. Johns River. And he said that that would be a separate territory for formerly enslaved Africans, and that no whites would live in that territory, and it would have a military buffer. And so that's the actual 40 acres and a mule that would be an actual separate territory. And the reason why he even worded it that way is because when he met with a group of ministers right before he created Sherman's Field Order 15, and he asked the ministers, what is it? And at that time, the ministers were considered the leaders of the community, not much different than today. But anyway, he spoke with a group of ministers. They chose the elder minister to be the spokesperson. And he asked the question, slavery is about to end. We're about to win this war. What is it that you would like? And they said, and the response was, we know how to take care of ourselves if we have some land. We know how to grow food. We know how to build our own homes. And we will be able to take care of ourselves and contribute best if we're able to have our own land. And so the second question was then after that, do you want that land throughout the United States, or do you want to be separate? And he specifically said that he felt that they would best be served by being in a separate territory. And so interesting, then the next question was even though he was a spokesperson, he was answering all the questions, he then polled all the other ministers, and all the other ministers, I think it was about 20 ministers or so, all the other ministers said yes, they would like a separate territory with the exception of one minister. And so that's how Sherman's Field Order 15 came out. So I want to going back to the five forms of reparations. So compensation, restitution, dealing with the legal standing, the citizenship of people of African descent, which is still questionable even today, would have to be addressed. And that would be one way that it could be addressed. So the third form is rehabilitation. So rehabilitation looks at what are the psychosocial trauma that has happened to a group of people, and how do you heal that? You know, we talk about, for example, when there's a school shooting and counselors are brought in, and there's some people that have done some great work around this post-traumatic slavery syndrome, post-traumatic slavery disorder. That trauma gets passed on generationally. And at no point from the point that slavery ended in 1865 to now have we as a people had a chance to really heal ourselves, to really have the type of proper counseling, the type of collective healing that's needed to address the trauma, not only for what happened in slavery, not only for what happened in Jim Crow, but what continues to happen today when police are killing our people, when they're snatching a woman up out of Waffle House and pulling her clothes off and brutalizing her for no reason, and on and on and on. The list continues. We can name many things that even present day situations of the abuse of African people and the trauma that we continue to experience in this country. So then the fourth form is satisfaction. So satisfaction addresses how do you restore the dignity of a people? Because a large part of the problem of what has happened to us as a people is that our culture has been undermined. We even see ourselves as less than or inferior to Europeans. There's the great experiment that was done with the white dolls and the black doll, and how black children, African-American children, would pick the white doll over the black doll and say, that's the one that looks pretty, or that's the one that looks beautiful, or that's the, you know, things like that. And that experiment was done, I think, back in the 60s or 70s, and then even repeated recently, and still with the same results. So there's a whole area around changing it, we like to say changing the narrative in this country around the role of people of African descent as it relates to reparations. So we're talking about changing curriculum. We're talking about memorials, commemorations, museums, special days of commemorations, apologies. All of that fits in the area of satisfaction. How do we restore the dignity of people? And then the last one, which I always say to people is the most interesting one. And again, this is coming from the United Nations. Non-repetition. So non-repetition means then we would have to design our reparations package in such a way that white supremacy, or what some people call white supremacy, that the perpetuation of the crime, as I said, which still happens today, every day we turn on the news, that we would have to design it in such a way that that could not continue. That those that you know, whatever it would look like, but the economic exploitation in our community, the police brutality in our community, and on would have to cease going forward. One of the things that I particularly argue is that that would include releasing all men and women who are in jail, who find themselves prisoners. And that's, again, another conversation we could come back to. But again, so going back over it, the 5 forms of reparations from the United Nations: compensation, restitution, rehabilitation, satisfaction, and non-repetition. So those are the things that I think that people need to know about reparations, that definition, in the United Nations International Definition of Reparations, the 3 roads to reparations, and the basic definition of reparations. Now, you asked some specific questions around, I think, HR 40 and where we're going with that. So in terms of HR 40, and like I said, Cam will be a greater resource than myself, but one of the strategies now is that we're looking at coming up with a strategy where instead of having Conyers, well, we know Conyers is out of Congress now. So the idea is now to have a collective voice for HR 40. So what that means is that we're in communication now with the Progressive Caucus of the Congress to have a spokesperson who will be the champion HR 40. We're looking at the Asian Caucus to identify a person to be a lead spokesperson to support HR 40. We're looking at the Hispanic Caucus to identify a person to be a lead spokesperson to push forward HR 40, be a co-sponsor of HR 40, and as well as the Congressional Black Caucus. And there's some, again, some of the details and politics of who that person is going to be. Like I said, Cam could best present that, but we are, of course, will have a member of the Congressional Black Caucus to be the lead person. And we've always continued to endeavor to get the Congressional Black Caucus to all of the members of Congressional Black Caucus to sign on HR 40. We have not succeeded at that as of date, so that's still ongoing work in Cobra. I think there were some other questions you asked me, but so
about how many members of the CBC have signed on so far? And I'm sure I could look that up, but just if you have a sense.
That's a good question. Actually, and Cobra produced something just recently called the HR 40 Primer. If I can hold that up here, it's on our website. People can download this. Awesome. It gives you information. You know, HR 40 was actually updated in 2016. In 2016 Congressional Caucus session of Congress, excuse me, and it was updated. One of the things that was done was those definitions that I just spoke of was added into the United Nations language, was added into HR 40. Another reason was updated was we know there's enough research out there already to determine the vestiges of slavery, the linkages from what happened to the enslavement period and Jim Crow to today. So we don't have to spend a lot of time on that. So now HR 40 is more focused on presenting the Congress reparations remedies to address racism and the vestiges, the vestiges of the enslavement period. But I just wanted to say, as a part of this HR 40 primer, we do have listed all of the Black Caucus members. I don't know if you probably can't see that, that have signed off on it. I don't know if I could count this real quick.
Mm-hmm. And I'll download it as well. And just real quick while we pause, I want to say that Max Hess, our interim ED, just got on the call, and he was actually one of the people I mentioned who were early on talking about reparations. And Max is also from Atlanta. Okay. And then Lynn Layden is on our reparations committee, and Lynn is a professor with me at Pacifica Graduate Institute, California. That's how we know each other. But Lynn, really quickly, can you tell us about your organization as well?
Yeah. I'm representing a group called Psychoanalysis for Social Responsibility. It's part of the American Psychological Association. And we are hoping to contribute to this project in whatever way we can, including helping with getting of HR 40B out of committee.
Awesome. And just so, Max, since you came on, and both Lynn and Max might, follow up with a question. Just so you know, we talked about the first couple of questions, the current state of reparations. We didn't really get into successes and failures, but we talked specifically with some definitions, and Brother Jomoke described the criteria that the UN laid out, as well as some definitions. And we just talked a bit about HR 40 and a strategy that Cobra's using.
Thank you.
All right. So the last question, we were asking how many members of Congressional Black Caucus actually signed on.
So at the time of the printing of this book, I counted 35 names. And I believe a couple more have signed on since then. When we were in Selma this past year, Maxine Waters, who had not signed on, Brother Cam Howard did confront her at a town hall meeting, and she agreed that she would sign on. So I'm not sure if she has done that yet, but and I think maybe one or two people may have signed on since then. I believe we have about 48, 49 Congressional Black Caucus members, so we still don't have 100% of the Congressional Black Caucus members that have signed on as of today. Also, here in Georgia is Hank Johnson, Congressman Hank Johnson, which I know has not signed on. Actually, I spoke to him recently at an event just about a month ago, and he said he was going to look into it. I need to follow up with him on that.
Awesome. Can you speak to some of the what you might call successes or failures? And you may not use that language, but
Well, okay. I saw that you had mentioned, I think one of the questions talked about the lawsuits. And, interestingly, some of us look at the lawsuits as a tactic to show our people that because we know we don't feel that we will get success with lawsuits. And in my opinion, based on even the definitions that I just gave, we know that reparations will have to be framed in terms of public policy to address all of those areas. So that even a lawsuit is not even, in my opinion, the best way that we need to go about it. But one of the strategies I've heard some of our lawyers say is that let's do the lawsuits so that so we can show our people that that's not an effective tool, or that we tried it and it didn't work. Because some people say, well, why can't we just sue the United States or, what have you? And they say, well, we tried that, okay, and that didn't work. So that's why we need to work on a different strategy. And so, we did have a strategy at one point that was looking at we had what I call actually the dream team of lawyers that were looking at creating a reparations lawsuit. On that team, you had people like Charles Ogletree, a Harvard law professor. You had Johnny Cochran. You had Will Gary, who I think is considered one of the top class action lawsuit attorneys in the country. We had attorney Faya Toure, also known as Rose Sanders, who worked with the Black Farmers lawsuit, as well as some of the other attorneys, I believe, who worked on the Black Farmers lawsuit. And then we even had people who were consulting, who not necessarily attorneys, but who were consulting on that top-notch historians like Dr. Leonard Jeffries and many others. And so, like I said, and Ajo Ayaturo, who was the Cobra lawyer at the time. And so, again, they looked at a lawsuit and felt it would be too challenging, from what I understand, to put forward a national lawsuit. So then they said, well, let's focus on a more localized lawsuit. So they looked at the Tulsa race riots as a possible lawsuit. And what happened was, as I understand, is that the state of Tulsa, state of Oklahoma, created a commission to look at whether or not reparations should be paid. And their commission said, yes, reparations should be paid based on what happened. However, the state didn't do it. So their own commission said, yes, reparations are deserved. And so that, but then the state didn't follow through and put any money into that. That would, I guess, if you want to say, in terms of strategies or success or failures. But again, yeah, like I said, I wouldn't really want to so much use that language, because really all of it is stepping stones on the journey toward reparations. Myself and others, we have always maintained that the way reparations is going to come about is has to be a mass movement, and not even HR 40 or even a good lawsuit or anything strategic or even some people argue that we can win at the international level. I say we can get support at the international level, but we know the history of the United States not necessarily abiding by United Nations mandates. The United Nations, doesn't really have any enforcement power to make a nation do anything. So it's really, so even if we were to have successes in the international arena or the United Nations, it would still come back to public policy that would have to be created in the United States. So ultimately, what I personally say is that it's really going to have to be a mass-based movement where we shut down Washington, D.C., where we shut down America, where there's no doubt that this is what the masses of our people want and are willing to back it up by their actions.
I would tend to agree with that, and add that the importance of grassroots efforts as well. But just continuing along with the questions about litigation. So Max, do you want to ask that question? It was about Farmer Pellman litigation.
Sure. The Farmer Pellman litigation took a different avenue. They, Farmer Pellman was suing corporations for their roles in, rather than, governments. State of Oklahoma, for instance, instead of suing government, she was suing corporations for their roles. And I was just wondering if Cobra was involved in that at all, followed that. I think it was entirely her effort, but I wondered if Cobra was involved at all.
Yeah, what I understand is that actually Farmer Pellman was nurtured somewhat by Cobra. So it was actually Cobra that helped inspire her to go forward with that lawsuit. Now, to exactly what degree we were involved in the lawsuit, I'm not sure how much we were actually involved in terms of an Cobra lawyer working with her. But I understand, I do know that she was influenced in her earlier years by Cobra, and the work of Cobra actually helped to nurture her as a law student and becoming and then taking up the challenge of reparations.
Well, so to follow up with that question, since, I don't know if so the litigation, while not necessarily productive, given, various reasons, I'm not going to say not productive, right? On a previous interview, we spoke to Hannibal Johnson from Tulsa, who writes about Black Wall Street. And he was, speaking to some of the approaches to litigation that he had followed. And, this is the last question, but I want to circle back after this to another, two more things. But without calling litigation a failure, would you say that litigation is at an end, at least at this stage? And are there other ideas that might be tried in like the short term, like in lieu of the building of a movement, stuff like that?
Well, it's interesting. I think in terms of the federal legislation, I think the two main obstacles, from what I understand, and around the legal issues, and people have much more expertise on this than me, but was around two issues: sovereign immunity, which says that a government has to allow you to sue them, and as I understand it, and the other issue is statute of limitations. Now, in terms of the issue of statute of limitations, what I do understand though is that in the World Conference Against Racism in South Africa, in the document that came out, there was slavery was declared a crime against humanity. So based on international law, as I understand, when something is declared a crime against humanity, then that forfeits the issue of statute of limitations. So that can be addressed. Also, I think in terms of lawsuits, if I understand also about the Deidre Pellman case, is that it was dismissed without prejudice, which, again, says I'm not such a legal person, but what I was told, what that means is that we can bring the case back again in a different way. So I think there may be some, people who may be looking at some legal strategies. Again, that's not my area of expertise. And also, one of the things that Cam has been asserting is that in terms of the case for reparations, we don't have to make the case for reparations anymore. We've made the case. Now we just need to go, and what he calls it is reparations enforcement, which is we need to figure out ways of enforcing the fact that reparations is deserved. And so, for example, the example he uses is, say, like, we know that during the civil rights era, say there were, and laws were passed to desegregate schools. However, we know that some in certain counties or certain states or certain towns in the South, they just said, we're not going to honor that national legislation. We're not going to honor that. And they would, physically block the doors or whatever. And so activists had to be called in. Sometimes National Guard had to be called in or whatever to actually enforce this type of legislation. So he said we're in the stage of enforcement. Like I said, it'd be really good to do an interview with him as well. And so, but I think that what I'm saying is that one of the things that he also asserts is that there's different forms of what we're now saying criminals, now that slavery was declared a crime against humanity. So one of those forms of criminals are families, another one is institutions, another one is corporations, another one is governments. So perhaps some strategy there have been people that say, perhaps we could put government off for a while and just maybe focus on corporations or families or institutions. Like I mentioned, what's going on with the college at the university level, reparations movement that's happening there. And I also think that perhaps going after some of these smaller victories, should say maybe targets, could help to, with success, that money could be used then to fund the bigger reparations demand. So I would say we haven't given up on a legal strategy. And I think that there are certain things that possibly could be still tried right now.
Thank you. I want to go back to one of the questions that emerged from restitution and, 40 acres and a mule, sovereignty. How do we, look at reparations and land when this country stole that land from indigenous people? So I'm just curious about that, that particular aspect. I do know that Native Americans, or not all Native Americans, but some of the folks that I've talked to and worked with talk about decolonization as opposed to reparations, but some do talk about reparations and returning land and so on and so forth.
Yeah, that's a good question. We get that in this movement. To me, there's a couple of ways, or at least about two different ways I think that we could address that. Well, one is we have to look at historically what are the indigenous people, because if we do our research, what we've uncovered is that indigenous people were us, were melanated ones, were ones who were here even before what we call Native Americans or First Nations. And so the earliest civilization that we know of in Central South America are the Olmecs. And the Olmec civilization clearly would be considered, African today, or Negroid features, or however we want to look at that. Now, the second, and so that's one thing of looking at it, is that we say that we are those ones. We are the indigenous ones. So this land was ours even before the enslavement period. So that's one way. The other way I think that we can address that is the fact that, as I keep mentioning, the Provisional Government Republic of New Africa and other formations, we've had communications with Native American brothers, with specific Native groups, the Seminoles, the Black Cherokee, the Cherokee, Chickasaw, Choctaw, and other groups as well. And we've had conversations with them about sharing the land and partnering with the land, and creating governance with each other on the land. So those conversations have been had and are continuing to be had.
And one thing, when we did with the Truth Telling Project, we did a panel discussion around this at one point, and we didn't talk specifically, but and then also when I went to Standing Rock, we had conversations about Black folks and quote unquote Native Americans, and I'm not even going to say quote unquote, but Native Americans. And so, for instance, the Cherokee Nation just expelled some of their Black people, or their Black people. And then if we look at historically, the reason why Black folks were brought were because there was a sense that Native Americans could not handle the work that we were put under yoke for. And Ibrahim Kendi, in his new book, suggests that not that there was complicity, but many Native Americans were all too happy and encouraged Black African slavery and then you know, but not like getting into that, you know, back and forth, you know, argument, or even trying to have an argument about that, but just trying to understand this even more.
Yeah, I think that issue is a complex issue. I am familiar with that around, you know, what we could say is that, you know, some of the Native Americans have begun to, you know, incorporate some of the European ideology and have practiced racism within their own ranks. You know, lighter skin versus darker skin. I mean, even I mentioned the Olmecs, but we could also mention the Washita, which also is documented existence in the area of Louisiana, and even spreading out, which now we call Louisiana, Mississippi, and Arkansas, in that area, you know, thousands of years before what we call Native Americans were in that area. And so I'm not sure where you were going with that, but yeah, there are some
and just real quick too,
there are some challenges with our Native American brothers and sisters in this conversation as well. This is true.
And Cherokee's own slaves.
Yeah.
And as a, you know, so that was an interesting conversation. But maybe
and
that
sometimes though, you know, again, I'm not totally defending. I mean, again, it's a complex issue. Sometimes that was done as a benefit to the enslaved Africans as well. Just like, you know, people will say African Americans own slaves. Well, if I buy my family into freedom, you know, there was a sense that sometimes that was done for strategic reasons as well. But then, you know, again, also it was some negative examples of it as well. So you're right about that.
And just to round out that part of the conversation, Black people also were forced to kill Native Americans to get freedom, the Buffalo Soldiers.
Right.
So it seems like there's a conquer and divide colonial framework on top of us all. But then the last question I wanted to speak to you about was just going back to, as you were describing the meaning of reparations. And, you know, one of the distinctions that I like to make is there's a difference between equity and reparations. Like, for instance, equity would be what a decent society does for impoverished folks, and for, you know, Black folks and Black communities, by having autonomous communities where, you know, people have a say-so in their policing, or people have a say-so in resources and education, that is the basis of a decent society. But reparations is repair that goes beyond, you know, racial equity, right? Reparations is, you know, all of the areas that you mentioned. So I mean, what do you think about that conversation? And do you think there's a difference between racial equity and reparations, or what are some of the similarities?
Yes. Well, you know, one of the things also I think that's important to emphasize about reparations is that reparations is based on Kujichagulia. You know, as I was thinking about even the you know,
creativity.
Slavery, huh?
Just so the other folks know, Kujichagulia is Swahili for creativity.
Self-determination.
Self-determination. Sorry about that.
Yeah, Kujichagulia means self-determination. Kiswahili for self-determination. Sure. So, meaning that oftentimes what we're seeing in reparations, and I guess I don't even know if I say so-called, maybe I should say reparations agreements, is that the people who did the oppression or is determining the terms, just like I was, determining the terms. Like, even like I said, when we were talking about the 13th and 14th Amendment, the terms of even the ending of slavery, which, changing it to the, with putting in the caveat saying except for a punishment for a crime, so really just reinventing slavery. And then, like I said, imposing the 14th Amendment, which says we're now citizens without us saying that we wanted to be citizens, not giving us the option. So, or even some of the things that's going on with the colleges, for example, where They're saying, well, we'll put up a marker to denote this history, or we found an African burial ground on our college campus, we'll put up a marker, but not asking the current students, you know, African-American students or African-American alumni or even African-American community, what is it that we feel like Georgetown, for example, just using Georgetown example, should do to make amends. So the thing is that reparations has to be on, I don't want to say the victims, but on our terms, such that, you know, whatever, you know, we might say, yeah, basically, so that, yeah, so I think when you deal with the issue of equity, it seems like it's still trying to create something based on other people determining the terms, whereas reparations is we determine what the terms are going to be. And I think that's also an important point of the reparations movement as well.
Thank you so much. This was amazing. I feel like most of the stuff you said, you brought a lot of clarification around it for me. Are there more questions from Lynn and Max?
I also just want to really express my thanks. That was really amazing. Thank you.
You know, I was thinking about when you was mentioning the equity thing, I was thinking about, I saw this poster. See if I can do it by describing it. I saw this poster and it has 3 people looking over a fence at a ball game. Actually,
yes.
Huh?
Yeah, I know what you're talking about.
Right, and so they, to distinguish the difference between equality and equity, right? So, and there are 3 different heights. So then they give each one of them one box, which is equal, but then there's still one of the people still couldn't see over the fence, right? So then equity would mean you establish the boxes in such a way where each person can see over the fence. But then another version I saw was where they just tear the fence down, right? and then that was freedom. But then I was thinking about what you were saying, which is making repair. So even tearing the fence down, if some of the games say one of the people couldn't see over the fence, now you have to maybe give them some tickets to the game for free, in addition to them just being able to look at the game, right? So
or we might not want to go to the game.
To compensate, huh?
Or we might not want to go to the game.
Oh, that's true too. I was just thinking that in terms of what you were saying, in terms of compensation, maybe they get a year free popcorn and soda. I don't know.
Yeah, Max, were you going to say something?
I was just going to say that I got new insights all around. Thank you so much.